The reason your score is stuck is because you don't have a system for learning from your mistakes. You see, when most students miss a question, they circle it, glance at the right answer, and they move on. Maybe they tell themselves, I'm going to remember that next time. But the human brain doesn't work like that. You're not going to remember it unless you capture what went wrong and why. And that is where the mistake journal comes in. And so by the end of today's class, you're going to have a real system you can use starting today to make every mistake pay you back in points. So if you haven't already, open a notebook, a Google Doc, or just write this down on your screen, LSAT Mistake Journal with today's date. This will be your single most valuable LSAT tool. Not your prep book, not your course, but this. And I know that sounds dramatic, but I've seen it over and over. Students come to us stuck in the 160s, they start journaling their errors the right way, and within a few weeks, they're finally seeing movement again. And so that's what we're building right now. A mistake journal that doesn't just track errors, it fixes them. And I want you to hear this clearly. 1 hour of clean review with a real mistake journal can beat 3 hours of random new practice with no reflection. A focused hour where you unpack why you missed it, what tricked you, and how you'll catch it next time creates compound growth. So picture this. Instead of rolling the dice on your next practice test, you walk in with 5 new guardrails you wrote yourself. You've got an if-then rule for causal arguments. You've got a trigger for strong language. You've got a timing plan for the first dozen questions in logical reasoning, and a clean way to map author's attitude in reading comprehension. So my goal for today is to give you steady, visible, weekly progress. Not a one-time, I hope I get lucky jump. I want you to look at your results every 7 days and say, that rule I wrote down, it saved me on 3 questions. So write this at the very top of your document, bold it, underline it, put stars around it if you want to. My journal exists to convert mistakes into points. The goal here is not to vent or collect notes for the sake of feeling productive. The journal has a job. It takes the pain of missing it and converts it into points you can bank up. And so by next week, if this journal is working for you, you should be able to point to 3 repeat patterns you identified, 3 if-then rules you wrote to stop them, and at least 1 timed set where you used those rules in real time. And if you can show me those 3 things a week from now, I can almost guarantee that you will see improvement. Sometimes small, sometimes big, but you will see movement in the upward positive direction. When you can explain a gain, you can repeat that gain. And your journal doesn't care how obvious the miss felt. We don't label ourselves, we label patterns. You are the engineer of your own improvement when you use a mistake journal. Now let's anchor this whole thing in a simple framework you can remember. I call it the laser approach. Learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. And the big idea is that your mistake journal lives in the review step, but it powers every other step of the process. Learning, accuracy, sections, and exams. Most people think that review is the thing you do at the end if there's time. But review is actually the engine that tells you what to learn next, how to practice for accuracy, how to structure your timed sections, and what to focus on when you take full exams. So first is the learning phase. This is where you study concepts and strategies like necessary versus sufficient assumptions, causal reasoning, author's attitude in reading comprehension, that sort of thing. But you don't just guess what to learn. Your journal hands you the syllabus. If your journal entries keep saying, fell for strong language and logical reasoning, your learning block tomorrow should be drills on strong versus weak language and how it shows up in questions, stems, and answer choices. Next, we've got accuracy. These are untimed or lightly timed sets where you practice the exact patterns your journal flagged. Not random sets of 10 questions, but they should be targeted. So for example, if your journal entries show that you miss causal arguments, you run a drill of 10 causal questions on weaken and strengthen, for example. The third phase is sections, and this is where timing begins to matter. You take those same patterns into real-timed 35-minute sections of either logical reasoning or reading comprehension, and you layer your guardrails on top. Pacing, prediction, and tagging strong language. Your journal told you what to watch for, and now you test it with timing built in. Then fourth, we've got exams and endurance. Full-length timed exams to work on your pacing, your mindset, and your stamina. You practice recovering after a tough passage or a weird stimulus, and you test whether your if-then rules hold up under pressure. Did you actually spot the unless trigger, for example? Did you slow down on always or never? Your mistake journal, your wrong answer journal, becomes your coach whispering in your ear. And finally, you've got review. You circle back, you log the misses, the shaky corrects, the slow solves, and you label the pattern. You write the if-then, and this is the loop, review immediately feeds learning again. The cycle repeats, and that's how you get compounding improvement. So let's wire this into your actual mistake journal document. You add 5 bold headers, 1 per line. Learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Then, under each header, you leave a little space. You drop in mini notes as you go, what you're going to learn tomorrow, what drill set you'll run, which section you'll take, which stamina tweak you'll test, and then you have your actual journal entries. And one more mindset shift before we move on. Your identity is not that of someone who just takes a lot of practice tests. Your identity is someone who runs the laser loop. That is how you predictably move your score up. Now, a mistake is not just a red X on a score sheet. If that's your only definition, you're leaving free points on the table. In my world, a mistake is anything that would fail under pressure on test day. So that includes your misses, your guesses, your slow correct answers, and your shaky correct answers. And I'll run through each of those. First is your misses. I mean, yeah, it sounds obvious, right? You chose the wrong answer. But you don't want to stop at just, I blew it. Your job is to diagnose why. Was it the stimulus? Was it the core of the argument, the trap language? Did you skip prediction? A miss is the starting point, but it's not the whole story. Then you have your guesses where you got it right, but you were kind of rolling the dice. And if you couldn't explain why your answer was right in one sentence before you checked, it's still a mistake, because on a different day, that coin flip lands tails and you get it wrong. We can't rely on luck. Then third, you've got your slow correct, where you got the right answer, but it ate up 3 minutes and your pulse spiked. That is a hidden score leak. And on test day, that time cost shows up 5 questions later. If the solve wasn't repeatably fast and clean, it belongs in your journal. Then fourth, you've got your shaky correct, where you got the right answer, but for the wrong reason, or your reasoning was kind of mushy. Maybe you liked the wording, but the logic wasn't good. Maybe you knocked out the wrong answers for the wrong reasons and defaulted into the right one, but if you can't defend your choice by tying it to the job of the correct answer, it's shaky, and so you've got to journal it. Now you're wondering, why am I so intense about this? Why am I categorizing everything? And it's because most students only log the obvious misses. That means they only learn from maybe 10, 15 questions per test. But top scorers double or triple that by journaling every single failure, not just the red X's. And that's how they improve faster. Now, let me give you a couple of examples you will definitely recognize. The first example is the lucky guess. You pick C because it sounds right, you're out of time, and you move on. Later, you see that it was correct and you feel good. But inside your brain, nothing changed. There's no new trigger, no new rule. And on test day, if the same pattern appears, you're going to be guessing again. And so for that reason, in your journal, that entry becomes guessed right, weak in question, causal reasoning. I didn't predict the job. I chose the first option that mentioned the topic. New rule, if the conclusion is causal, I've got to check for alternative causes or missing controls before I read the choices. Then next you've got example B, the slow correct, where you spend maybe 2.5 minutes on a single necessary assumption, you bounce between B and E, you finally pick E, and it turns out it was right. You feel relieved, but you're not really confident. And so in your journal, you want to write down, this was a slow correct, necessary assumption question type. I didn't form a clean gap statement. I read the choices to find the gap instead of predicting it. So now I've got a new rule. If it's necessary assumption, I write a 7 to 10 word gap prediction first, Yet then I use the negation test on contenders. You see the difference there? You're turning a vague lucky guess into a repeatable rule, and that is how points stick. So now you want to hardwire this into your wrong answer journal in your Google Doc. At the very top, you can add this exact line, copy me word for word here. We're journaling 4 things: misses, guesses, slow correct, and shaky correct, because all 4 of those fail under pressure. Then you add 4 tiny checkboxes you're going to tick on each entry for each of those 4 possibilities. And this does 2 things. First, it forces you to be honest. And second, it helps you see patterns by failure mode, not just by question type. Because maybe you're actually fine on flaw questions, but your slow corrects cluster on them because you don't predict the flaw category first. That is a different fix than I'm bad at flaws. And for bonus points for an additional upgrade, you can add a confidence line before you check the answer. And so if your confidence is 4 or 5 and you're wrong, that's a high-risk pattern you've got to fix immediately. If your confidence is only 1 or 2 and you're right, that's a shaky correct you should shore up with a quick retell. 1 sentence on why the right answer had to be right. So you want to ask yourself after each set, did I miss? Did I guess? Was I slow? Was I shaky? And what would fail on test day? And if you expand your definition of mistake like this, you're going to triple your learning opportunities without adding a single extra question. That's how we make faster progress with actually less work. The first field is the source. We always start with where the question came from and under what conditions you attempted it. Because a miss from practice test 159, logical reasoning section 2, question 14, under full timed conditions is totally different from a miss in a slow untimed drill sitting on the couch. So your source includes the prep test number, the section number, the question number, whether it was timed or untimed, and the date. The second field is the section and the timing. So you capture what the timing conditions were. Were you going fast? Were you slow? Were you right at the buzzer? We're just measuring here, so you write down the section and the timing. For example, logical reasoning, spent 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Target was going to be 1:25. And so that one line tells future you whether this was a logic issue, a pacing issue, or both. In the third field, you include the question type. So you're not just writing assumption here, you're writing necessary assumption or sufficient assumption. Don't just write inference, write down must be true or most strongly supported. And then you say as you type, question type, necessary assumption. And if you're unsure of even what type it was, you just start and we confirm in review after the fact. Then in the fourth field, you write down what you predicted before looking at the choices. And this one is a game changer. Before you look at the choices, you write down what job did you expect the correct answer to do. And if you didn't predict anything, you say that. You've got to have the truth on paper so you can fix the habits. You're writing down here a single plain sentence. Prediction: the right answer must plug the gap between premise and conclusion by assuming blank. So for example, prediction: the author assumes there's no alternate cause for the improved test scores besides the new curriculum. And you want to keep this short, just about 10 words, because that forces you to be clear. Then in the fifth field, you write down what you chose and why. You're sharing your actual thought process in just 1 or 2 sentences. So for example, I picked B because it mentioned the new curriculum and sounded relevant. I didn't test it against my prediction. Then in field 6, you include the correct reason and pattern name. So you are extracting the lesson. You're stating why the right answer is right in 1 sentence using your prediction language. Then you name the pattern that describes your miss or the test maker's trap. So for example, you write down correct reason, choice E states, there were no significant changes in teacher quality, which addresses alternate cause risk and matches my prediction. The pattern name is causal conclusion without ruling out alternatives. And if you like categories, you could name it causality or alternate cause as well. Then field 7, you've got your new rule or trigger. This is your if-then. So we want a trigger you can spot in the wild and a default action you'll take. So you write down, for example, if the conclusion is causal, Then I must predict at least one alternative cause before I read the choices. If I'm unsure, I scan the correct choice for no other changed language. That is a rule that tells you what to look for and when. Now, notice that this process keeps things short. It keeps them specific to the logic, not the topic, and it ends with a trigger you can spot instantly next time. That's what makes all of this worth doing. So again, your 7-field template, you include the source, the section and the timing, the question type, the prediction before the choices, what you chose and why, the correct reason and the pattern name, and the new rule and trigger. You can also bolt on, in addition to that, your confidence level before revealing the answer, and whether it was a miss, a guess, a slow correct, or a shaky correct. Now, we've also got to look at context, because not all misses are created equal. A miss on question 7, only a minute and 10 seconds in, is a very different animal from a miss on a late section question 23 after you'd already burned 3 minutes on the previous question. So the context lets you diagnose the real cause so you can fix what went wrong. So we're going to standardize exactly what you capture at the top of every entry. You add these mini fields word for word. You add the prep test number, section number, the question number, and the position, because earlier in logical reasoning usually means simpler core logic, and later means the structure is more dense or there are more steps involved. You're also including timed versus untimed and how much time you spent on the question. You also want to look at how far you were into the section because it helps you get insights into your pacing. You want to know if you're going too fast and you got to slow down, or if you need to alternatively speed up. You also want to know what environment were you in. Were you at a cafe? Were you at a library? Were you at home? Was there loud music in the background? Were you on your laptop like you'll be on test day, or were you on your phone? You also want to know your energy level on a scale of 1 to 5, your focus level, and your stress level. You want to know if you were burnt out and tired and fatigued, or was it a stamina problem? Were you underslept? All of this context helps you know what to adjust going forward. It tells you the energy and the history, the context of that particular question, that particular section. And of course, if you're doing these on paper, but test days on the computer, very different experience. And by the way, in general, with regard to these LSAT wrong answer journals, you want to have a template you can reuse every time. You want it pre-filled into your header. And so you keep a template doc with those 7 fields included, and you make a copy of it every single time so that when you start a new drill or a new section, you can just fill in the blanks as easily as possible, making it that much more likely you'll actually do it. You also want to decide your timing targets for logical reasoning in advance. For example, you want to solve the first 10 questions in roughly 10 minutes so that you can build up a time bank to apply to the later questions that truly need it. And you want to be honest as well. Don't sugarcoat things. If you were half distracted and your phone buzzed, you want to document that because that will help you know better what to adjust going forward and give you context for what you got wrong and why. Now, one of the big mistakes with mistake journals is vague labeling. Because if your journal says assumption or inference without the subtype, you're limiting yourself because different question subtypes have different jobs and therefore they have different fixes. If you give a problem the right name, you also will enable yourself to choose the right tool. And so in your mistake journal template, you want to write down the question family and the subtype, and whenever possible, the context tag as well. And so for logical reasoning, you might not note necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, strength and weaken, flaw, and when you're doing flaw, by the way, you can even label the exact specific type of flaw, like correlation causation, or equivocation, or out of scope, or necessary sufficient confusion. For inference, you want to label specifically must be true versus most strongly supported. If it's a principal question, is it principal application or justify the principle? And then, of course, in reading comp, several different question types like main idea, primary purpose, author's attitude, function, detail, inference, organization. All of these are unique separate question types, each one with its own unique job to be done. And so your mistake journal will include all of that specificity because then you have your task going forward what you want to adjust going forward. For example, you want to know for necessary assumption, you want to use the negation test. For reading comp author's attitude, you want to anchor the tone to specific lines in the passage. You also want to make sure you're clear on how to ID the question stem type. So for example, for necessary assumption, they will use words and phrases like depends upon, requires, and assumes. In contrast, for sufficient assumption questions, they will use words and phrases in the question stem like allows, enables, properly inferred if assumed, logically follows if assumed. And every question type labels triggers a default move. And so if the question type is X, your default move is Y. If it's necessary assumption, you do the negation test. If it's sufficient assumption, you look for a strong bridge that guarantees the leap. If it's a weakened question, you look for alternative causes. If it's reading comp function, you want to ask yourself, why is this sentence here? What is it asking us to do? And if you're not sure of the question type, just write down your best guess, come back later upon your review. And you also want to know what you want to look for each question type. What are you looking for in the passage or in the argument? And you can run that as a drill if you're not sure, if there's a gap in your understanding that's telling you maybe you want to drill this question type. And for a lot of questions, you want to predict before you touch the answer choices. Your prediction is the job description, and the choices are the job applicants. If you skip the job description, meaning you don't know what they're even asking you to do, the slickest, most tempting wrong answer is going to win, and it's usually going to be wrong. So you want to name the job quickly. Necessary assumption asks you for something the argument needs. For sufficient assumption, they're asking you for a strong bridge that guarantees a leap from premise to conclusion. For strengthen, you want to reduce alternate causes or show proper controls. For weaken, you want to introduce alternate causes or show alternate or reverse even causation. For must be true, you're just restating what the text already proved, not bringing in any new information. A common mistake is when students compare each choice to other choices rather than to the job to be done. In other words, you want to check each choice against the question stem, asking, does this do the job I just named? If yes, we keep it. If not, you cut it out. You are never looking for the least bad choice. You are looking for the one choice that matches the job description. And so in your 7-field template, in your wrong answer journal, below under the prediction part, you can add the job you need the correct answer to do. And predictions might feel clunky at first, and that's okay. As you do it more, it's going to get faster. And maybe it slows you down up front, but you save time on the questions. Your brain will start acting like it can auto-complete things as you do it more and more, because there are a limited set of tricks and traps they test on the LSAT. And if you can't predict perfectly, that's okay. You make a loose prediction. Even if you're saying to yourself, there's probably an alternate cause, that's enough to help you knock out some wrong answers. And if you can't predict at all, that itself is also useful information, because it's telling you that maybe you didn't understand the core of the argument. And so you want to go back, you want to reread, you want to find conclusion and support, and then you try again. And so you can add more lines into your prediction field. You can add your confidence level in your prediction, and you can ask yourself whether your chosen answer matched the job to be done. And if the answer is no consistently, that means you're not honoring your prediction and you're letting the choices talk you out of it. You can also add a T chart or a 2-column setup in your mistake journal with your prediction and why the right answer did that job. So you're training your brain to connect the prediction with the proof. So you're noting in your mistake journal the job, your prediction, then the chosen answer, the right answer, ideally. The correct choice does the job in this way. And if you cannot write those 2 clean sentences, you do not yet own the question. And so we ask ourselves, what's the job to be done? You make a prediction first, then you look at the choices. It's as simple as that. If I could summarize every single logical reasoning question, or the vast majority at least, we look at an argument, we ask, what's the conclusion? What's the evidence? What's the gap? The gap is your prediction. And then the question type tells you how to reframe your prediction to specifically match what they're asking for. And so the gap could be the flaw. The gap could be the underlying necessary assumption, depending on how you look at it. The gap could be that they failed to consider something or did not bother to explicitly state it. And then we fill in how to correct it to match what the question's asking for. And so for necessary assumption questions, for example, we are not saying the argument made a fundamental flaw. We are just saying they did not bother to explicitly state this underlying premise. And so we're going to call that out explicitly. We look through the choices. If we're not sure, we ask ourselves, which one of the following, when negated, would destroy the argument? And by destroying the argument, we are then telling ourselves that this choice must have in fact been the underlying necessary assumption. And so this mistake journal I'm talking about here, it gets more and more detailed over time as you continue to log your mistakes and note the particulars. So you write down, it was a careless mistake, a misread, or I rushed. And those kinds of words might feel true, but they don't really teach you anything. So you want to replace those vague labels with more surgical sentences you can actually act on. You want to look at the exact move you made, what the test maker did, and the tiny word or step you missed. So for example, let's say it was a causation trap, like in strengthen or weaken or flaw. You want to note the exact move you made. For example, I treated correlation like causation. I assumed the change caused the result. Then you note what the test maker did. For example, they mentioned a timing change and let me fill in the cause. Then you note the tiny word or the step that you missed, like I didn't check for alternate causes or controls. So to read it back clean, I read faster than I thought, and I let after imply caused. Next time, I will predict an alternate cause before looking at the choices. Or let's say, for example, it was confusing necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. So you pick a strong bridge as if it were sufficient assumption on a necessary assumption question. The test maker was offering you a powerful statement that was not required. Then you know that your mistake that you missed was that you skipped the negation test. So to read it back clean, you might say to yourself, I forgot the job on necessary assumption is required, not sufficient. So I will negate contenders on necessary assumption before I pick in the future. Or let's say it was a reading comp attitude question that you missed. For example, you matched the topic instead of the tone. You picked a neutral answer for an author who was actually critical. The test makers used friendly wording about the topic, but they ignored the author's subtle criticism. As for your mistake or your miss, you didn't anchor the tone to a specific line reference. Going forward, you will underline the attitude word or phrase and choose answers that match that tone. Or let's say that you fall for a choice that is similar but not supported by the argument or the passage for a logical reasoning must be true question. So let's say, for example, maybe you picked an answer that repeated the same nouns, but it added a new claim that was not in the text. The test maker was tricking you by echoing the passage's vocabulary to make new information feel proven even though it wasn't. Your mistake was you didn't proof each verb or adverb against the text. And so going forward, for must be true questions, you're going to prove every part of the answer with text and cut out any extra verb strength that you see. And so this kind of documentation is specific and it's brief, and that's what you want. So your guardrail to avoid making this same mistake in the future is that if your cause is not something you can practice and correct tomorrow, it's still too vague. And so you want to ask yourself why 3 times. If you say, for example, I misread the conclusion, I would ask you, why? You answer, because I didn't separate premise versus conclusion. Again, I ask you why. You say, because I didn't mark the conclusion indicator or restate it in my own words. And so the real cause here is that third why. You didn't mark or restate the conclusion. And the good news is, that's fixable. You just got to restate the conclusion before looking at the choices. It's as simple as that. And so let's say that you confused necessary and sufficient in the conclusion. You didn't restate the conclusion or name the flaw before looking at the choices. And so we ask, why didn't you name the flaw? Because you skipped prediction. Why didn't you skip prediction? Why did you skip prediction? Because you didn't slow down to restate the conclusion in your own words. The fix would be, on flaw questions, you restate the conclusion and you name the flaw before looking at the choices. If you can't, you flag it and come back later instead of guessing. So this ends with a new behavior going forward. You're not just apologizing or beating yourself up. And so that is the new approach going forward. You always ask yourself why. For alternate cause, you say, I accepted the stated cause without ruling out other changes, like blank. Or for reverse causation, I ignored the possibility that the effect caused the supposed cause by blank. Or for sampling or a survey flaw, you say, I trusted a small or non-representative sample defined by blank. Or for equivocation, meaning word shift, I let blank change the meaning between the premise and the conclusion. For a scope shift, I allowed a claim about blank to become a claim about y, or x about y. And so you see the idea here. We're always looking for an actionable key takeaway to course correct going forward so that you can avoid making the same mistake again. Now, there are 2 language checks that will help you expose wrong answers fast. And so I want you to write these in the margin of your wrong answer journal. You want to look out for language that is overly strong on must be true questions or inference questions, unless the passage itself is also that strong. If you see vague praise or criticism in reading comp, you want to make sure that the tone of the choice matches the text showing that same level of praise or criticism. Otherwise, you want to knock it out. And during review, you want to say, this choice is wrong because blank. Next time, I will do X or Y before reading the choices going forward. So for example, and you could steal these, by the way, for logical reasoning, necessary assumption, if you skip the negation test, you say, I chose a strong but unnecessary claim. They dangled a tempting, powerful bridge that wasn't required, and I missed the word depends. Going forward, I'm going to write down a brief 10-word gap at most, then negate the contenders. For logical reasoning must be true where they echo the topic, you might say, this was wrong because I picked a statement that repeated nouns but added a new verb claim. They used familiar vocabulary to hide new information, and I didn't check the verbs against the text. My new behavior going forward for must be true, I will underline the verb or the adverb in the answer and prove it with a line reference. For reading comp function questions, you might say, my answer was wrong because I treated a counterexample sentence like new evidence for the author. They placed it after a claim to test role recognition, and I didn't ask, why is this sentence here? Going forward, on reading comp function questions, I will label each paragraph sentence as a claim, evidence, counter, or definition before I answer.